Resident Evil is the longest-running horror franchise in the gaming industry, and that's a hell of an achievement for a genre where games rarely last long. Here, 3 games, 1 multiplayer spin-off, shut down. Dead Space, 3 games, 3 spin-offs, shut down. Silent Hill, a respectable track record, but the series appeared 3 years later than Resident Evil, so it still hasn't lived as long. And then there's Alone in the Dark. Technically older, sure, but calling that living is a bit of a stretch, isn't it? Meanwhile, Resident Evil has already gone through 9 mainline entries, 15 spin-offs, 4 remakes, 13 re-releases, more than 50 ports, 7 live-action films, one of which is already a reboot, 4 animated movies, live-action and animated TV shows, 15 novels, 6 manga series, and 3 stage plays. And that's not even close to the end. So how did Capcom manage to build a practically unsinkable franchise in one of the most difficult genres? A series that players all over the world still love and buy? I know the answer. Memes. Resident Evil is one of the most meme-generating series out there right now. Every new installment spawns at least a handful. The memes flood social media, get pushed everywhere, advertise the game better than any marketing campaign, and the game sells worldwide. That's it. Case closed. Actually, of course, the situation is much more interesting. I'm going to tell the story of how Capcom used to be embarrassed by its own meminess, but eventually embraced it and turned it into one of Resident Evil's greatest strengths. How the studio made the best decision of its life twice, securing the series a status of almost absolute immortality. And funniest of all, did it completely by accident. And of course I'll tell you how the Jill Sandwich Bingo, the Boulder Puncher, Thomas the Tank Engine, the Shitbird, the 3-meter Dimitrescu Towel, the Village Villain Hand Puppets, and Leon cruising around Raccoon City in a ridiculously stylish Porsche came to be, with a face that, according to legend, was the direct result of a carefully conducted survey of every woman working at Capcom. Now that's husband material. Let's start with Patient Zero. Resident Evil was created by Japanese developers who were absolutely obsessed with American culture. They drew inspiration from popular Western blockbusters, films that were already exaggerated to begin with, and tried to bring all of that onto the screen. In a way, the result was something like a parody of a parody. The Tyrant T-103 was essentially Japan's T-800, while T-102 was inspired by aliens. In Resident Evil 4, you can run straight into a Leatherface, and in Resident Evil 7, you meet the rest of Chainsaw Massacre family. But it wasn't just the monsters. The heroes themselves were also riffs on Western movie archetypes. Take Chris Redfield, pumped-up soldier type, clearly borrowing from the classic action movie like Predator. Leon, on the other hand, comes straight from the archetype of the cop who unexpectedly finds himself in a nightmare situation and saving the day. Basically Bruce Willis in Die Hard. Not visually though. Visually he looked more like a River Phoenix, who was very popular in Japan at the time, or Leonardo DiCaprio, from whom he may have even borrowed part of his name. But DiCaprio wasn't yet at the peak of his career back then, so the connection is probably unlikely. Ironically, once he did become a huge star, he ended up indirectly resembling a character from another Resident Evil game, Code Veronica, where many people noticed the similarity between the actor and one of the protagonists, Stevie Burnside.
This thing is too cool!
By the time Resident Evil Outbreak came out, the developers had completely dropped any pretense of modesty and practically smuggled the entire Hollywood Walk of Fame into the game. Basically bootleg copies. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Cameron Diaz, Nicole Kidman, Chris Tucker, Alec Baldwin and Ving Rhames. And even though Capcom never officially confirmed any of it, but journalist Alex Aniel, the author of An Unofficial History of Resident Evil, has said that in context, the references were blindingly obvious. So, from the very beginning, Resident Evil gathered every single caricature of a Hollywood blockbuster under one roof. And they all spoke like caricatures from Hollywood blockbusters too, but through the lens of Japanese screenwriters. Which meant, first of all, even more exaggeration, something that Japanese culture is already pretty fond of.
I am a god.
I am the god of the new world.
It meant that the characters had to throw out simple cartoonish one-liners to make things feel like an American movie.
Hasta luego.
Hasta la vista, baby.
And on top of that, it meant that the voice acting process itself came with a whole barrage of complications. For example, Capcom back then, and even today, is one of the most secretive Japanese companies out there, extremely protective of the confidentiality of all its projects. Like, obsessive. I realize how ironic that sounds just a week after the entire gameplay of Resident Evil Requiem leaked online before release. But that was clearly someone's major screw-up. As a result, during the recording of the very first Resident Evil, the actors basically had no idea what was going on. They didn't know what game they were recording for, they didn't know the context of the lines, they didn't even know the order those lines were supposed to appear in. Lynn Harris, who voiced Rebecca Chambers, described the experience like this: "No one ever told me what scene any of the lines belonged to. I just had to work with what I was given. The decisions about where the voices would be used and in what context were made by the developers, who, as far as I could tell, didn't really understand English very well, if they understood it at all." Barry Geard, who voiced, Barry, confirmed this too. "For everyone dying of curiosity, no, I didn't improvise or make up those ridiculous lines about the Jill sandwich. They were in the script, and my job was simply to read them. There's no democracy in a recording session. If you want the job, you don't complain." There was another issue too. There was no Japanese voice acting, at all. And Resident Evil, or Biohazard, was actually targeting the Japanese market as well, not just for export to West audience. Shinji Mikami, the creator of Resident Evil, once explained that English is a mandatory subject in Japanese schools, but most people in the country still only understand it partially, which actually means that the writers had to constantly and deliberately simplify the story and the dialogue so that any Japanese player could follow it. The bigger problem was that Japanese voice acting didn't arrive in Resident Evil until 2012. Among other things, that meant that all the way up to Resident Evil 6, we kept getting extremely simplified, exaggerated, almost cartoonish lines and situations, many of which eventually become part of the Hall of Fame of gaming memes.
Take a look at this.
No thanks, bro.
It might be handy if you, the master of unlocking, take it with you.
It looks like your party has been cancelled.
7 minutes. 7 minutes is all I can spare to play with you.
We were almost a Jill sandwich.
You could have barbecued both of us! Running off like that was reckless and stupid!
Women.
If we're gonna die, then we should get to choose when it happens.
Complete global saturation.
What is this? What is it? What is this?
What is it?
What is it?
What is that?
What is this? What is it?
What is it?
What are you buying? Where's everyone going? Bingo?
And that was it. Those memes escaped into the wild. They became part of slang, cosplay, even everyday life. There's even a popular climbing spot somewhere in Utah with a massive boulder that climbers have nicknamed Resident Evil. Memes, as they tend to do, outgrew the game itself and started advertising it on the developer's behalf through pure word of mouth. They sold the game better than any marketing department ever could, and by the mid-2000s Resident Evil had become one of Capcom's most profitable franchises. What's funny is that this happened completely by accident. The developers never intentionally tried to make the game memeable. Sure, Leon in Resident Evil 4 is clearly written with a fair bit of irony. The number of puns in that game probably exceeds the limits set by the World Health Organization.
Sorry I couldn't get in touch sooner, but I was a bit tied up.
And then there were things like Tofu Mode, where the player controls a living block of soybean curd. But according to insights shared by Alex Aniel, there were no plans to deliberately make the first Resident Evil a caricature. It was simply a genuine attempt by Japanese developers to recreate what they thought was cool American-style action.
Did you kill Enrico?
Really?
Yeah, like this.
Rebecca!
And just to show that not much had changed years later, here's a quote from Eiichiro Sasaki, the game director of Resident Evil 6. "We are aware of those things, but that doesn't mean we go out of our way to create those situations. When we're making the story, we try to come up with lines that reflect the situation that is happening in the story. Everything has to match the story. I personally have lines which I'm a fan of, and the fans have their favorite lines as well. But we don't say to ourselves, let's put this line in the script and everyone will like it and it will become a meme. That's not something we try to do. I think it's something that's born out of people's experience with the game. But that is about to change." But for now, what's interesting is something else, because this approach to writing had a pretty curious side effect. Let's start from the beginning. From day one, Resident Evil was built for export to the West, but it was actually sold in Japan as well. Hence, the game features fully English voice acting and only English, but simplified to the point where any Japanese player could understand it, without much trouble. And from there, you get an equally simplified script, because you can't really tell a nuanced, complex story when you are writing in English that basically sounds like.
That works for me. Good plan, sir.
And as a result, that primitive plot becomes the foundation for the entire Resident Evil series. Just in case, I need to be clear. I'm not saying the lore is primitive. The history of Resident Evil world is actually pretty layered, especially because so many important details got scattered across spin-offs, comics and novels. Just to give you an idea of how tangled the lore became, here's the interesting story behind it. In 2002, Hiroki Kato, one of Capcom's game designers, took on the job of writing Wesker's Report, a pseudo-documentary set in universe. It was bundled with the expanded edition of Code Veronica X and Resident Evil Remastered. The report's whole purpose was to briefly summarize everything that had happened in the universe up to that point. Kato later admitted he only dared to write it while drunk, and even then he still packed it with as many inaccuracies and contradictions as humanly possible, simply because he couldn't keep all the threads straight. That's about lore, but the main plot of almost every numbered entry, up to arguably Resident Evil 6, was so simple you could easily summarize it in a single sentence. Some government or special ops people arrive at a mysterious location, get attacked by infected locals, uncover a conspiracy by the people behind the outbreak, and eliminate everyone responsible. Everything else is just details, like how many people were sent in at the start, who needs to be rescued along the way, and exactly how Umbrella is tangled up in it this time.
Umbrella.
What?
For the franchise, such a simple narrative framework meant two things. First, new players could hop onto this insane train almost whenever they wanted. Despite the number 2, 3, 4 or 5 in the title, newcomers weren't actually missing much of the bigger picture. There are not so much references to all previous games, and thankfully the main cast changed often enough that players weren't burdened with the character's past. You have no need to dig through their whole backstories. Now try starting Dead Space with the third game. Suddenly you're expected to know that Isaac destroyed the marker in the first game, built a new one between the first and second, freed himself from its influence in the second, started a relationship and somehow lost it between second and third. You get the idea. For a horror, a genre with a relatively high barrier to entry, every additional layer of complexity cuts away part of the audience it desperately needs. And a world this flexible also makes it easy to change locations whenever you want. That constantly creates a sense of novelty for both longtime fans and newcomers, who again find it easier to jump into a franchise when it isn't tightly chained to the original setting. A second visit to Raccoon City implies the first one, meaning you'd have some catching up to do. So, with the exception of the third game and couple spin-offs, Resident Evil is almost always traveling somewhere else. Different states in the US, China, Southern Europe, South Africa, Russia. The viral tentacles stretch across the globe, and the only explanation any player really needs to validate the setting is Umbrella was here. That's it. And try to set Silent Hill anywhere other than Silent Hill, and you'll immediately hear the outrage. The second side effect of such a simple narrative framework was that it became extremely easy to adapt. Which is exactly why Paul W.S. Anderson managed to spawn a whole series of film adaptations that, at first glance, didn't even seem that far removed from the game's plots, mostly because there's no complex plot to begin with. Even as the quality of the film series gradually declined, the adaptation still produced 6 movies and hundreds of millions of dollars at the box office, turning into massive promo for the games by being everywhere in theaters. At the same time, there were animated films. Then the movie series got rebooted, not very successfully though. A TV series, an animated series. Capcom spread the Resident Evil brand across as many platforms as possible, because the narrative structure made that easy to do. By the same logic, spin-off games were actually easy to produce too. Manga was easy to draw and novels were easy to write. The template was universal, just change the location and swap out the characters. And watch the franchise expand, slowly spreading out to fill every available inch of space. This production assembly line ended up fueling Capcom's initiative, and the company began to diversify Resident Evil as much as possible. They ported and released original projects on virtually every device and console imaginable, from Java phones and the 3DS all the way to PC and PS5. They kept producing numbered entries for longtime fans while actively remaking the classic games for newcomers, essentially helping to give birth to the remake culture itself with the release of Resident Evil in 2002, one of the most successful titles in the series. Feel free to blame Capcom for the fact that the entire industry has been clinging to the past for decades. Capcom sent Resident Evil into single-player, co-op and multiplayer, used fixed cameras, third-person, first-person and even VR, produced countless collaborations with games like Rainbow Six Siege, Dead by Daylight and Fortnite, added a variety of extra modes like Tofu, the Mercenaries raid mode and Ghost Survivors to keep hardcore gameplay fans engaged, and released story DLC like Separate Ways, Lost in Nightmares or Not a Hero for players who simply wanted to extend the narrative a little longer. Capcom also experimented with Resident Evil across a wide range of genres: rail shooters, action shooters, PvP shooters, asymmetric multiplayer games, card games, and even turn-based strategy. At one point they even ventured into psychological horror, though it didn't work. It was a cancelled prototype of Resident Evil 4, now internally known as Resident Evil 3.5, and on paper it looked very similar to Silent Hill. They also wandered into slasher territory, and that experiment did work. Another early prototype of Resident Evil 4 drifted so far away from the horror formula that it eventually grew into a completely separate franchise, Devil May Cry, a well-known story many of you probably already know.
What's the point of packing a sword like that if you aren't even gonna use it?
In short, Capcom was throwing everything at the wall and expanding Resident Evil dramatically. And it worked. The reach became so enormous that at some point in history we crossed the threshold where it was almost impossible for a person on Earth not to have encountered the Resident Evil brand at least once. Not that all of this was directly tied to the series' meme-like tone or the simplicity of its storytelling, but the entire Resident Evil arsenal was clearly the result of just how flexible this series' narrative framework was. You could bend it in almost any direction. But let's rewind a little, back to a time when Resident Evil projects had not yet proven itself to be such an obvious success. That simple narrative framework the Resident Evil games relied on was never some universal formula, and repeating the same scenario over and over eventually started to cause problems. The first warning sign came with Resident Evil 3. Despite its success, it was already clear that the series was beginning to repeat itself and needed a breath of fresh air. Resident Evil 4 became that breath of fresh air. It shifted the balance much further toward action, added a more playful tone to the grim horror, radically reworked the gameplay, placed the camera over the protagonist's shoulder and introduced more open environments to explore. But it didn't fundamentally change the approach to storytelling. The plot was still simple, still ironic and still memeable.
I'm sure you boys didn't just tag along so we could sing Kumbaya together at some Boy Scout bonfire.
By 2009, the concept hadn't really changed either. As Tsukasa Takenaka, one of the writers of Resident Evil 5, put it, Capcom favors the fun for the gamer over story during development. But then 2012 comes around and Resident Evil 6 finally releases, and for the first time in the series, a numbered entry finally receives Japanese voiceover. This is where the game suddenly explodes with characters, throws in a maze of tangled plot lines and introduces 4 separate campaigns whose protagonists constantly cross paths with each other, only for the whole thing to collapse under the weight of too much action, a stripped-away horror atmosphere and an overwhelming pile-up of events. It's time for another reboot. Resident Evil 7 became a new chapter in the history of the series, and this time it offered players a genuinely deeper, more nuanced story, fully developed dramatic character arcs, and the atmosphere of psychological horror. There's no place for cheesy one-liners, caricatures, or memes.
Welcome to the family, son.
We have a history of rather cheesy dialogue from 20 years ago, things like the Jill sandwich line and moments like that. Those scenes have become cliches that everyone seems to love, and sure, they're funny, but the dialogue in the earlier games wasn't exactly the best in the world. We wanted to make sure that Western gamers would appreciate the credibility of a more realistic script this time. But Capcom's attempt to go meme-free is saved by pure accident. The sixth game wasn't the only Capcom failure before 2017. A little earlier, there was Operation Raccoon City, which was trashed by both players and critics. A bit later came Umbrella Corp, which got dragged through the mud even harder. The same fate befell the 3DS spin-off The Mercenaries 3D. Revelations did fairly well with critics, but financially, it really struggled. The PSP port of the original Resident Evil was cancelled. In other words, one of Capcom's Platinum franchises suddenly lost its appeal, both for players and for investors. There's no payoff. The games were taking too long to develop, and each one was built almost from scratch, because the engine made it difficult to reuse assets between projects. Resident Evil 6 itself, despite ultimately failing, had its development restarted from the ground up multiple times. Capcom had sprung a leak, one that was slowly draining both money and time. So, to finally patch that leak, Capcom's engineers came up with a single viable solution of their own. Create their own highly flexible in-house engine, RE engine. The engine became the perfect solution to Capcom's problems. It was flexible, universal, and if something was missing, developers could immediately reach out to the internal engine team and have the feature added that same evening. It was ideal for multi-platform games, it handled assets efficiently, it let developers carry war from one project to the next, and according to the producer of Monster Hunter, every internal Capcom studio contributes to the engine's development, rather than just waiting for the core engine team to implement the features they need. Over time, the following games were developed on the RE engine: Devil May Cry 5, Monster Hunter Rise, Street Fighter 6, Dragon's Dogma 2, Exoprimal, Monster Hunter Wilds, numerous smaller titles, and Pragmata, which is still on the way. And of course, as you might expect, every modern Resident Evil entry has been built on it. Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil Village, Resistance, Reverse, along with a whole bunch of remakes: RE2, RE3, RE4. The engine truly simplified and accelerated development across Capcom. It turned out to be so flexible that players themselves eventually got their hands on it. And just like that, the series receives a second life. Don't get me wrong, Resident Evil 7, Resident Evil Village and the remakes were excellent in their own right. The gameplay, the tone, the important changes that expanded the universe where it actually needed expanding. All of it lifted the series back onto its pedestal, earning praise from both audiences and critics alike. But mods actually triggered a massive wave of attention. Heated discussions across social media, streamer reactions, TikToks, shorts, reels, survival horror suddenly burst far beyond its natural habitat and stormed into the homes of gamers everywhere. And it seems that this wave of fan enthusiasm did not go unnoticed, because shortly after that, for the first time in 20 years, Capcom finally embraced its own memeness. Remember the Jill sandwich?
Jill sandwich.
You do. In the 2002 remake, the line was still there, but the wording changed.
A second late, you would have fit nicely into a sandwich.
And it suddenly sounded much more proper, much more normal. It was boring, alright? As if Capcom had become embarrassed by its own cringe and tried to smooth things out, while still attempting to stay faithful to the original. But then the quote returned in Resident Evil 4, again, slightly altered, but in a recognizably comedic form.
Hate to say it, but we're sandwiched alright.
And in the remake, it comes back with the maximum expression.
We're sandwiched alright.
In the end, the Jill sandwich became part of Resident Evil's cultural heritage. It even made its way into the menu of the Capcom cafe chain of fast food restaurants. And when the Nemesis remake came out, it was turned into a full combo meal. Remember Bingo?
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
And surely Bingo returned in the remake too. Well, actually, not so surely.
You know what? They actually wrote another line in place of that. We did it a few times. It just didn't feel right on set. And the cinematic director said, you know, for shits and giggles, let's just throw in the bingo line. And I was like, really? And then he put it in, and it made the game. Where's everyone going? Bingo.
And at the very end of the game, there's even a tiny Easter egg. On the sticky note attached to Hannigan's monitor, it reads Bingo, Friday 10 PM.
Oh, that's where everyone's going.
Remember Chris punching the boulder in Resident Evil 5? Then there's Heisenberg, one of the village's bosses, who suddenly brings up the former STARS member right in the middle of the fight. And of course, the iconic merchant from Resident Evil 4.
What are you buying?
Got a shout out from the equally memeable merchant in Resident Evil Village.
What are you buying? Just something an old friend of mine used to say.
The Duke is a meme-worthy character in his own right, just like the Transformer-like Heisenberg. The doll from House Beneviento, and of course, Lady Dimitrescu herself. Nothing like the grim, disgusting bakers from Resident Evil 7. In fact, Village didn't just reference our favorite well-known memes, it actually generated a whole bunch of new ones of its own, including Lady Dimitrescu's height, Dimitrescu's assets, Ethan Winter's assets as well, or rather the modular nature of his limbs. Thanks. And of course, there are some standalone quotes as well. The most famous one is this.
Stupid man thing! Stupid man thing! Stupid man thing! Stupid man thing! I'm fucking bawling!
Even the remakes, while trying to recreate every classic meme from the originals word for word, still managed to throw in a few new ones, which slipped into the Resident Evil universe as if they had always been there.
Get off my train, shitbird!
There's actually a much deeper meaning behind all of this than simply exploiting meme potential and going viral on social media. No, the real point is that this is precisely what ended up granting the entire Resident Evil series its immortality. Now watch closely. A long time ago, Resident Evil memes escaped far beyond the boundaries of the games themselves, and relatively recently Capcom finally embraced them as a natural part of the series' DNA. Not only did the company start leaning into them heavily inside the games, it also turned them into part of the marketing. The most obvious example is that meme slang sleep to company social media. The official Resident Evil account used the bingo line to draw attention to the remake. The official franchise portal even put together a bingo card for players preparing to remake, with squares like oil drum ready to explode, suspicious picture, elevator with no power. And a full year before the remake was even announced, the developers quietly hinted at it by quoting the famous note from the very first game. For itchy, tasty. Which, like many other lines in the original, came from a clumsy translation from Japanese. And that's exactly what made it meme-worthy. I already mentioned how the Jill sandwich ended up on the menu at Capcom Cafe, but on top of that, it also became part of Resident Evil's collaboration with The Division 2, pulling a bit of the looter-shooter audience into a residence of memes.
Jill sandwich, that's it. This is it, it's a Jill sandwich.
Lady Dimitrescu's height also became part of the marketing campaign. Capcom installed life-size stands of the vampire in the gaming shops, gave away 3-meter towels featuring the villain, and even decorated double-decker trams in China with her image, which in context feels especially perfect meme material, particularly given the national sensitivity around average height. And finally, Capcom released an entire mini-series based on Resident Evil Village with puppets. Meanwhile, other horror games were promoted in ways you'd normally expect from the genre. The marketing team behind The Evil Within showcased videos of terrified players reacting to the game's horrors. The marketers for Until Dawn talked about how developers measured test players' physiological data, things like pulse and sweat levels, to make sure every moment was sufficiently scary, tweaking scenes that didn't quite land. And the marketing for Dead Space 2 famously showed the game's most disturbing scenes to mothers. Then documented their disapproval to highlight the fact how grim the game actually was.
Your mom hates Dead Space 2.
All of this advertising communicated one simple message: you will be scared. At the same time, in Village's puppet show, the characters literally sing. This video was a direct response to how players reacted to the previous game. After Resident Evil 7 came out, Capcom launched a survey asking players why they hadn't bought the game, and the most popular answer was, unexpectedly, because it's scary. So the trailers for Village began deliberately sending the opposite signals: that it would be brighter, that there would be people, that there would be operetta-like caricatures, that there would be a new fetish, and yes, that it would be scary, but also very fun. And with the 9th game, it's the exact same story. For every jump scare shot, every tense play of light and shadow, every stalking monster, there's a shot of hot Leon, deliberately designed by the female half of Capcom staff so players could develop a crush on him and flood the internet with edits. A Leon who throws out spin kicks like in the good old days, and who also drives a sleek Porsche, which, thanks to Leon's long and complicated history with cars, has already become a meme. And even if you still haven't played Resident Evil Requiem and know absolutely nothing about its contents, you can probably already guess that the new entry is packed with memes, and that Capcom is confidently continuing its trend. So, let's keep it brief and spoiler-free.
We can begin your treatment. Silent treatment, I hope.
I think I want a second opinion.
Sorry, but I'm not on the menu.
When was the last time you brushed your teeth?
That's my cardio for the week.
I thought I had a short fuse. Aren't we fancy?
You must be the town lumberjack. You'll have to take the next one. I guess this is my stop.
Sorry I couldn't get in touch sooner, but I was a bit tied up.
Sorry, I was a little tied up.
Tied up.
Tied up.
In the end, Capcom has carved out a very comfortable niche of healthy absurdity and pure fun within the horror space. Resident Evil promises not just darkness and fear, but also fun, action and memes. Dead Space, for example, always presented itself with a completely serious face, and there are already plenty of videos about how science fiction horror doesn't combine fans of sci-fi and fans of horror. It actually ends up appealing only to a small overlap between those two audiences. Silent Hill leans heavily into psychological horror, which creates another barrier to entry for the genre. Even Shinji Mikami, the creator of Resident Evil, chose to keep self-irony to a minimum in his newer series The Evil Within, and the games never quite managed to step out of the shadow of their older sibling. No one has managed to outlive the unkillable Resident Evil. And much of that comes down to this delicate balance between suffocating dread, grotesque horror, darkness, cosmic unease, and pure fun. As Koshi Nakanishi, the game director of Resident Evil Requiem, put it, "If sushi hadn't been invented yet, a fish lover would just want to eat sashimi, raw fish. A rice lover would just want rice. We're the inventors of sushi here. Even if you think you want one style, the flavor of this game comes from the combination of the two styles." In the end, Resident Evil isn't really about the T virus, the C virus or the G virus. It's about the M virus, where M stands for meme, and it spreads across the world at incredible speed, unleashed by the sinister corporation called Capcom.
I've been bestowed with lures, settlers.
You talk too much.
Failed.